So one of the interesting things that, looking back over how internationalization was practiced, particularly in the British Columbia context, but not exclusively British Columbia. But Kyra Garson and I put this slide together a few years ago, 2018, to talk about what are these various stages that internationalization, research, scholarship, practice in British Columbia, across Canada, and other parts of North America. What stages have we been going through? And the four stages that we identified at that time was the early the 1990s. In the early stages, we saw very much, it was an outbound focus. The beginnings of transformative learning, so the belief that if people go abroad, they find themselves in a foreign culture, they learn a little bit of the language, they have in-depth experiences, it has the potential for the transformation of perspective. And at that time, there was some modest recruitment of international students to our Canadian schools. But it wasn't at the level it is right now. So the recruitment was modest. However, things started to shift in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, and we started to see an increase in recruitment. And at that time, the dominant literature really was looking at internationalization at home. And the thing that was interesting at that time, and having facilitated a good deal at that time, we really emphasized the benefit to domestic students by coming into contact with these modest numbers of international students, and the perspectives that these international students were going to give to the domestic students, as well as, of course, our international students were going to gain insights into Canadian and other societies. But it was very much in the early stages of internationalization at home, that way of thinking. It started to change around the late 2000s into 2010 area, where critical intercultural theory and an idea of inclusion started to become much more important. I think one of the reasons was because immigration was having a pretty profound impact on the development of Canadian society and the makeup in classes. And people were starting to recognize that it's not just about international students, but it's also about newcomer students, etc. And we are also starting to look at more critical intercultural theory, histories of colonization, etc. And what were the real impacts of that, and what is the true purpose of higher education in this day and age? Because there was a large pushback against globalization. So we were questioning some of the foundational structures of globalization and the motivations of maybe the earlier two stages. We didn't see it as benign anymore. This really got a shot in the arm. It got supercharged around 2015 when the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action came out. And it really put critical intercultural thinking on the table, and this idea that our entire educational approach has to be more inclusive. So we have to think about international students. We have to think about settler cultures that are Canadian settler cultures. We have to think about newcomer cultures, and we have to think about Indigenous cultures. And how do we create an inclusive interculturalization that engages in different ways across difference, and also helps those differences come together and understand one another and work and be with one another in a more equitable and fulfilling way. So we see this trend developing, and it'll be very, very interesting now to see how in particular since this past summer, the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. It's going to be a very, very interesting, I think some interesting trends are going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years because of that influence.